from, so I'm certainly happy to hear from you about that tonight.
Yes, and I think
So,
that's
well,
actually the aspect of the book that's received the most attention, which has been good, and but also at the same time, from a uh, let's say from a marketing point of view, it's also a political memoir, and to some degree, have failed to get out the message to the people who are purely political, if you like, that it's also not a bad read in terms of the political history of the last 30 years, or the parliamentary federal history. It doesn't pretend to be comprehensive.
so welcome, Bill. Bill is joining us from Winnipeg tonight, so he's at 6 o'clock, and we want to honor the hour timeline for the webinar. We know that Bill has an award to receive later tonight, and maybe he'll mention that to us in a moment. I'm here in Burlington, and it's 7 o'clock my time. And the webinar will be 1 hour, and it will be recorded for those that weren't able to be with us tonight. Bill, I'm just going to read your bio, and then we'll start with the webinar. And tonight is a little bit different than some of the webinars we've done in that this will be an interview between Bill and I. We've prepared some questions for you on the topic of Bill's book that he's written. Bill Blaikie was ordained to the ministry of the United Church of Canada in 1978. In 1979, he was elected to Parliament. He was re-elected 8 times and retired from federal politics in 2008 as the Dean of the House of Commons. Over the years, Bill was the NDP critic for health, environment, foreign affairs and trade, served as House Leader and Parliamentary Leader, and in his last term was the first New Democrat to be Deputy Speaker of the House. In 2009, he was elected to the Manitoba Legislature and served as Minister of Conservation until October 2011. He is currently an adjunct professor in theology at the University of Winnipeg and director of the Knowles Wordsworth Centre for Theology and Public Policy. So welcome, Bill. I'm going to start with a question about someone you refer to in the book as Father Bob Ogle. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah,
He's a member of Parliament from Saskatoon, being referred to as the God Squad. In fact, it is a title of one of your chapters. Could you elaborate a bit on the God Squad theme?
yeah. Father Bob Ogle, a Roman Catholic priest, was elected in the riding of Saskatoon East in 1979. He was elected for the first time in '79 at the same time as I was. And so in the fall of 1979, Father Bob and I were asked to go on a bit of a national tour. At that time, he was the NDP health critic, and I was the NDP social policy critic. These weren't responsibilities that were to last very long because, as you either might recall or have read, in the fall of 1979, the government that had been elected in May of 1979, Joe Clark's minority conservative government, was defeated. But in that brief window of that parliament, Father Bob and I undertook to go on a national tour, so to speak, and to look at healthcare in the various provinces and some of the social programs that were federally funded and others that were just receiving provincial money but might benefit from federal help. And so, him being a Roman Catholic priest and me being a United Church minister, sometimes when we arrived in town, we never got big headlines. There might be a little small article on the 5th page down in the inside corner that would say God Squad in town. And it was a sort of a humorous and somewhat affectionate takeoff on the fact that, here were these two clergy, NDP clergy and members of parliament who were in town. And, if you remember at the time, the NDP was the party which was seen as the political party that was mixing religion and politics. We had a small caucus then compared to what we have now, of about 26. And in the late 70s and early 80s, we had 5 clergy out of that 26. There was myself as the United Church Minister, longtime MP Stanley Knowles, United Church Minister, Jim Manley from the Nanaimo Cowichan in the Islands, who was elected in 1980, also a United Church Minister, and just most recently in the headlines again as part of that was taken prisoner by the Israeli Defense Force because he was on that ship that was trying to take supplies to Gaza, which I thought was a pretty gutsy thing for somebody who was 79 to be doing. And we had Father Bob Ogle from Saskatoon, and also Father Andy Hogan from Cape Breton. So that was a time when the left was the Christian left, if you like, was the group that had to answer questions about why are you mixing religion and politics. And of course, what happened over the next 30 years, 35 years, was that the perception of the relationship between religion and politics changed, so that at a certain point, you were thought to be religious and political. It was assumed that you were on the political right. Not so with the God Squad of 1979. But let's say by 2009, or even 1999, if people used the term God Squad, they probably were referring in a less affectionate way to politicians who were combining their politics on the right. The politics and the faith, that is to say, on the political right.
Thank you for that, Bill. You do talk in your book about the Christian right, and I have a question here about Stockwell Day and the Canadian Alliance Party. As a Christian in politics and Parliament, were you surprised by all the fuss made about the faith of Stockwell Day when he became leader
Well,
of the Canadian Alliance Party?
Although, to some extent, well, let's just say I was surprised, and uh, because I felt that as a Christian and as a member of Parliament, I had already been there for 20 years when Stockwell Day arrived, and nobody had made a fuss over certainly in the same way, or hardly at all, about the fact that I was a Christian and I was a member of Parliament, I was a politician. Now you might say, well, I wasn't the leader of the opposition, and I didn't have the prospect of becoming the prime minister anytime soon. But I think there was more to it than that. I think it was a combination of the fact that a certain kind of connection between uh, Christianity and politics had been established over the last 20 years between 79 and 89 in the United States, going back to the late 70s with Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, and then you've got, Pat Robertson and Pat Buchanan and on, this whole sort of movement in the United States. So people in Canada were getting more and more sensitive to that in the United States, and were looking to see whether it had any sort of Canadian counterpart. And by 1999-2000, when Stockwell Day came on the scene, they were more sensitive to that. But it's also the case, I think, that Stockwell Day was a little bit more forthcoming about his personal faith. He had been a pastor. He had been principal of a Christian school or a headmaster. He had more of a record, if you like, that people could look to to examine what his personal beliefs might be like. Whereas his predecessor, Preston Manning, had struck a more populist tone, if you like, and had talked less about his faith and was less identified with it. I think Stockwell Day, it was thought, had been propelled to the leadership of the Canadian Alliance over against Preston Manning because of the support that he had within the evangelical community, and because of their hopes that a reform party led by him, and which ultimately, if it was to become the government, would deal with some of the issues that were important to them. So a number of things contributed to that, but certainly I felt, for me, in some ways, it was a good thing, because it meant that I did a lot of interviews about the relationship between faith and politics, which nobody seemed interested in before. So I got to remind people that there was this older, and of course, this older tradition of mixing religion and politics on the left. And of course, there's an even older tradition all the way back to the Bible and the Hebrew prophets. Uh, in my view, religion and politics was always mixed. It's the question of have you got the mix right? And so I found myself in the odd position of having to, not having to, but in some ways wanting to defend Stockwell Day because I didn't like I didn't like the undertone that was, well, this guy's religious. Do we really want him in politics? I would rather have said, no, there's nothing wrong with people bringing their fundamental beliefs, whether they're religious or non-religious, to the public sphere. But then they have to be, willing to debate them and willing to put them on the table and willing to have a discussion. In this case, perhaps with other Christians about why he arrived at the political conclusions that he did when someone like myself arrived at other conclusions. So it was, yes, I was surprised, even somewhat miffed. Take for example, it was only a year or two later that Lauren Calvert, who's a United Church minister, became the Saskatchewan. And I don't recall a big fuss being made over Lauren, the fact that he was a United Church minister and he was going to be the premier of Saskatchewan. Now, so you have to ask the question, is it religion generically that's the problem? Or is it the is it the mix of religion and politics that Stockwell Day brought to the political scene that was part of the problem? I think it's in some ways both. I think there are people who have a sort of generic objection to mixing religion and politics, and they saw the debate around Stockwell Day as an opportunity to make that point. And then there are others whose concerns were probably more specific to to the particular situation.
I think the role of the media, too, is an important one. And you say in your book that after the 2006 election, Christian Week, which is an evangelical Canadian weekly newspaper, published an article called Christian Candidates Prepare to Serve Ottawa. And I believe in this paper there was reference to more of the right-wing Christian politicians, but you state you looked in vain for any reference to you or any other New Democrat, even those NDP members of Parliament whose strong Catholic commitment and involvement in their church had been highlighted did not merit recognition as Christians.
Both within,
so I think,
in this case, with respect to Faith Today, although ultimately they did have an article which they included me in, but it was not uncommon for them to talk about Christians in Parliament and just list the Christians they agreed with, or the Christians that came out of the same tradition. And ironically, the same thing was happening in the secular media. So you could find an article about Christians in Parliament in Walrus magazine, for instance, where again they would just list the right-wing evangelical Christians and not take note of the fact that there was this other collection of Christians who were members of Parliament, who were New Democrats, and so yeah, it's both the secular media and to some extent the religious media, at least on the evangelical side, had bought. I can see why one did it, because they were basically defining who Christian was as far as they were concerned, and they were defining people like myself out of putting us beyond the pale, so to speak. But why the secular media in some cases would do the same thing is another matter, and it continues to happen. Just a couple of weeks ago, Jeffrey Simpson had an article in the Globe and Mail in which he was commenting on the vote that took place in Parliament on the motion by a conservative backbencher to strike a committee to look at the question of when life begins. And this was widely seen as a way of reintroducing the issue of abortion. The Prime Minister voted against it, so did half the Conservative caucus, but half the Conservative caucus voted for it. it was defeated because, of course, between the half of the Conservative caucus and the Liberals and the Democrats that voted against it, it didn't pass. But the point that Simpson was making was that look at the role that religion plays in politics, and isn't this something, you know? And he was saying, we in the secular media, we don't pay enough attention to this, we don't notice it, but there it was for all to see, 80 Conservative MPs. But the mistake is the same, if you like, the same mistake. He only notices religion and politics when it fits a certain stereotype, when it's connected to two or three or four different issues. You know, if it's abortion, if it's issues having to do with sexual orientation or same-sex marriage, stem cell research, there's a kind of a set of issues. Would the same comment be made if there ever came to be a vote on the tar sands or on the pipeline or on Aboriginal rights or on other things, and MPs voted a certain way, but they voted in a way that was congruent with many pronouncements of the leadership of the churches, from the Canadian Catholic bishops to the United Church to the Anglican Church, all kinds of churches on a great many environmental and issues and other issues of justice. Would people say, oh, there's religion playing a role in Canadian politics? No, they wouldn't, because they've got a particular set of blinders on that only permits them to see religion and politics when it's mixed in a certain way. So, so to some degree, the thing that I was lamenting in the book carries on. In spite of the book.
And we have a question from Christopher here that flows from our conversation about religion and politics. Why should one's religious beliefs inspire political action? Does one naturally follow the other? And I know that you have a position that's different from the right-wing politics.
Well, I think
so. Maybe you can comment.
Not all religious beliefs do inspire political action. I would say that religious beliefs that are grounded in the biblical tradition, a tradition in which you find what I would refer to as the prophetic tradition, that kind of religion compels one to be involved in politics. That going right back to the Hebrew prophets. I mean, what many of the books of the Bible are about various prophets calling the ruling class or the ruling elite, or in this most often the king and powers and principalities of their day, if you like, to account for what kind of society they're creating. Is it a society in which the widowed and the orphaned and the stranger are taken care of or not? So you've got this prophetic tradition within the biblical tradition, and of course you have the teachings from a Christian standpoint of Christ himself. Who doesn't say to the rich person, the rich man who asks him what he needs to do in order to achieve the kingdom of God, he doesn't say to the rich person, what you need is a tax cut. He says, no, you need to change your life altogether. And so, in my view, proper reading of the biblical tradition, whether it's the Hebrew Testament or the New Testament, compels one to be involved in the world. I mean, for God so loved the world. It's not just that God so loved each one of us individually. There's this collective reality, if you like, called the world, that is the proper concern of God, and therefore the proper concern of anyone who wants to take that into account.
Do you think we do a disservice when we try to ignore the role that religion plays in politics? I know that's the position we often take in Canada.
From being able to understand completely what's going on. Now, we've done that in some ways for good reason. It's not always easy, and it's when you talk about religion and politics, it has to be done in a constructive, sort of non-aggressive way, because obviously, we know that We know that discussions about religion and politics in the past can lead to arguments, which can lead to division, which can lead to even worse things. So it's it's on the one hand something we need to do, but we need to do it well. And because we lost the confidence that we can do it well, we often don't do it at all. And part of what I'm about is just trying to be kind of a catalyst where I can to say this is something we need to talk about within the Christian community because we don't talk to each other very well, and of course between faith and between people of faith and non-faith because we also have a lot of tension, uh, between the religious communities as a whole and those, particularly those that I would characterize as sort of secular fundamentalists who want to drive religion out of the public sphere altogether. So that would be my response to that particular question.
I can certainly understand the desire to drive the topic of religion out of the political sphere, but I think that we do a disservice when we do that. We all come to the political discourse with our own ideologies and our own background, and so I appreciate your role as trying to put those on the table in an articulate and a healthy way, to name the ideologies and the backgrounds from which we're talking, and certainly your own emphasis on the social gospel and your background in the United Church and your own faith upbringing. I have a question here from Peter, and he asks, in the good and bad of politics, so switching topics a little bit,
Well, this
he's
is
sure there are
a
times when
question
you
that
felt the tension
I've
between
been
your
asked
faith
over
and
the
the
years,
requirements of serving as a member of
and
parliament. Can you comment on that?
it's a good question, but it also kind of reflects a view of politics, which I can understand why people have it. So I'm not trying to. I'll get back to the question, but I just want to say first off that I think wherever you're living out your vocation, whether it's in politics or the university or the hospital or the church or the railway shop or wherever it happens to be, uh, that these are not perfect places, and there's always going to be a certain amount of tension between how you think your faith informs a particular situation, or how you think the ethics that come out of your faith inform a particular situation, and what may be happening that day in your workplace. And I don't think politics is a special case. I guess is what I'm saying. I think that that's true uh, generally, but the fact of the matter is that when one has a political vocation, that happens in public, and it happens sometimes around issues, and people generally assume maybe that sometime the party or your caucus or your leader required everyone to take a certain position, and that you might have not shared that position, but that you took it anyway, and that was in some way or another a conflict with your faith. In my case, I didn't always agree with the decisions that we arrived at, but I never had a conflict in principle. I mean, if you're in a political caucus, you make decisions all the time, which are judgments about strategy and tactics, and what we should bring up today and what we shouldn't, or even many of the constitutional questions. What kind of Senate should we have? All kinds of procedural questions, which are ultimately matters that are matters of faith. You can't say, well, I'm sorry, but I'm a Christian and I believe the Senate should be constructed in a certain sort of way. These are issues that are open to debate. I was fortunate, perhaps, in the sense that I am a member of the United Church, and frankly, most of the time, NDP policy was very much uh, in sync with United Church policy as passed at conferences and general councils. And in fact, sometimes, uh, the church, was more progressive in some ways. So I was never I often got mail from people saying, I don't know how as a United Church, I wouldn't get it from United Church people, but I would get it from other Christians in other faith communities who would say, I don't know as a United Church minister how you could agree with this. And I would have to write them back and say, well, actually, this is the position of my church. If you're accusing me of being unfaithful to my church, I'm not, because this is the position of the United Church. You may not be aware of it, but that is the position of the United Church, not necessarily the position of the Presbyterian Church or the Roman Catholic Church. And so I was, I sometimes say humorously, I was subject to a great deal of speculation about the nature of my afterlife by my fellow Christians. And some of the nastiest mail I got as a member of Parliament, I got from other Christians who were basically calling my faith into question, and as I say, speculating about what my eternal punishment would look like, not agreeing with them as to what the Christian position was on a particular issue.
Thank you, Bill. I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit more on coming to left-wing politics from your faith perspective. My question is around your chapter that you devote to the social gospel as one of the traditions that contribute
Well,
to the
people do
NDP, and
still
we've
come
been
to their
discussing
left-wing
some of this
politics
already.
as a
Is this
result of
just a
their faith
historical
perspective.
observation, or do people still
There
come to
are,
left-wing
there are
politics
people
through
on
their
the
faith perspectives?
political and religious right who are forever pronouncing on the demise either of the left or of the Christian left or of the social gospel. If I had a dime for every time, even on the political side, that people said, "Well, the NDP is finished," and we know where the NDP is now in Parliament, and we've had a lot of ups and downs. And I think that the idea on the political side that the NDP represents, which is a critique really of the dominant paradigm, which is, you know, speaking now theologically, uh, as a kind of an idolatrous relationship with the market. That critique is not going to go away until our idolatrous relationship with the market goes away. But it's not, I use the social gospel in a kind of a general way. Academics sometimes use it to describe a period between the sort of turn of the last century and the 1930s. I use it more generally to describe everyone who's rooted in that tradition but may have entered it later. Uh, Basically, it's a tradition of Christian social action and theological reflection that is critical of capitalism, that is critical of the market, that is critical of the inequalities and the reductionist view of human life that comes with an over adherence to the market as that which decides how everything will be allocated, and ultimately kind of infiltrates all our values. So we're not just talking about the market; we're talking about the marketization of all our relationships. For me, I think the social gospel was still alive and well in the 60s and particularly in the 70s as a result of the all the ecumenical justice coalitions that were created in the late 60s and early 70s. And that was a time of great convergence, if you like, post Vatican II on the Catholic side, liberation theology on the Catholic side, and all these and a kind of energy coming out of the civil rights movement and the counterculture and the anti-Vietnam War movement. So you had in Canada uh, within the churches, Catholics and Protestants converging around issues of Aboriginal rights, of human rights in Latin America, of northern development, of 10 days for world development, just international development that was sensitive to the needs of the third world, Project Plowshares having to do with disarmament. The list goes on. I think it was about 12 of them. This was a time of great uh, ferment, if you like, at least at one level within the Christian community in Canada, and that was the context into which I graduated in 1977. It was the summer of the Mackenzie Valley Berger inquiry. It was a time when the churches still had an awful lot of say. The churches had presented often and substantially and convincingly to Justice Berger. And really, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline report, the Berger report, owed a great deal to the perspective that the church has brought to it. And it's really the last time, if you like, I think that the church has had such an impact on a national debate. Because after that, you get that convergence that I just spoke of breaking up as particularly as the Catholic Church became more uh, focused on issues having to do with the culture wars and as I say, issues like abortion, etc. And as the churches themselves, the mainstream Protestant, but also the Catholic churches, uh, began to fall into a certain kind of decline as a result of the internal debates within the United Church about sexual orientation, which used up a lot of oxygen. The debate that had to happen, but nevertheless, it was distracting from these other issues. And then, of course, the whole residential school saga, which again, I think it uh, took a lot of steam out of the church's clout in society. So a number of things have happened, and that happened alongside, of course, the whole sort of conservative neoliberal revolution, where a lot of the things that had been accomplished by the world that was created through the social gospel and others in the post-war era was being systematically dismantled with this return. I always thought it was a bit like Jurassic Park. I mean, you had all these ideas about the market ruling that I thought were long sort of buried and fossilized, and they rose up again in the 1980s, and through Reagan and Thatcher and Mulroney, and they were taken up in a quite accommodating and way by Clinton, Blair, Chrétien, and we see now after 30 years of that kind of ideology, we have greater and greater inequality. We have a lot of the things that were accomplished in terms of equality and a more just and fair society in the post-war era that are coming apart. Middle class is eroding. I could go on and on, but all I'm saying is that yes, uh, people came to their politics at that time, left-wing politics, through their experience of the ecumenical coalitions, and they still do. In the NDP, for example, in 2005, we decided to establish a faith and justice caucus because we were tired of the stereotype that says, well, if you're religious, you must be on the political right. So we wanted to show people, no, there's a bunch of us here. We're on the political left, and we are people of faith too. And we had a workshop at an NDP national convention at which I made some introductory remarks, and James Loney, who had been a captive in Iraq, I guess it was, with Christian peacemakers, also was the keynote speaker. While it was an NDP convention, there was thousands of people there, or maybe 1,500. We were competing with other workshops, and we had about 150 people there. And what happened was it was like a big coming out party. We say, well, why are you here? Well, I'm actually an Anglican. Oh, well, I'm active in my Mennonite church. Well, I'm active in this church. I'm active in that church. It wasn't just Christians, people from other faiths as well. So here was an example of the fact that people are there and actually understand themselves to be there as an extension of their faith perspective, but it's not something they were talking about very much. And what we're trying to do is to create an opportunity for people to do that, both for its own sake, but as a way of signaling to other Canadians that they shouldn't accept this sort of monocultural uh, paradigm about what constitutes relationship between faith and politics.
I have a few questions here, Bill, from participants, and I'm going to deal with the one from Christine first because it flows very well from what you've just been saying. She asks two questions that are related. In these days when membership numbers are
Well, I think
shrinking
you
in
know that's
mainline Christian
a good question, and
denominations, how
particularly
can
the
we
last part,
reignite
because
social movements of the
I
religious
you know I
left?
would
And what does it look like to
it's
be
not
doing
just
so in a multi-faith
enough,
way rather than simply a
if it ever
Christian
was,
left?
to to have a strong Christian left, but particularly when we're in a post-Christendom context, in a post-Christendom, multicultural, pluralistic, multi-faith, secular, hopefully not secularist uh, world, uh, we need to make connection with people in other traditions and in other faith communities, and of course people who are of no particular faith at all. But just talking now of faith communities, I think every faith, every religious tradition has within it what I referred to earlier as a prophetic tradition. Every major religion has within it a basis on which people care about the world and call the false gods in it that are operating in ways that are harmful either to creation or to justice. Every tradition, every religion has that tradition in it. And I think what we need to do is to know more about each other, to connect with those traditions in each other's uh, religious teachings, and go from there. I don't have a kind of a I mean, I wish I did. Wish I had a sort of a simple answer. Well, let's do this and that'll work. But I don't know exactly what will work, but I know that it is uh, worth working on.
Thanks, Bill. Christopher's question refers to a comment you made earlier, and he starts with the comment, perhaps you've heard the United Church referred to as the NDP at
Well, I mean, I
prayer.
think there
You echoed
there's
some of the
problems
truth of
if
this
a
in
church
talking
becomes
about
too
the
tight with any
tightness of
particular
United
party.
Church
I don't
policy
think the
and
United Church is tight with the
NDP
NDP.
policy.
I
Is
think a
there
lot of
nothing
what the United
problematic
Church
about
has
churches
called
becoming
for
too tight
on a
with any
policy
particular
level
party?
happens to be tight with what the NDP has advocated over the years, which is why United Church people find their way into the NDP, and maybe why some New Democrats are more sympathetic to the United Church than they might be to other churches who continually disagree with them. But at the same, but I don't. There's no. I know the joke about the United Church being the NDP at prayer, but I can tell you there are a lot of United Church people, and some of them, conservative MPs, who were very always quick to remind me whenever I might have been quoting from resolutions passed at United Church meetings that not everybody in the pews agreed with NDP policy. And of course, it's also the case, that looking at it from a congregational point of view, what might be what might pass without disagreement or discussion in one part of the city might be very controversial in another part of the city, because United Church people are like everybody else. Some of them, they are sometimes influenced uh, by where they live and what kind of lifestyle they have and what class they belong to, etc. But I'm not I'm not, and I never have advocated that there be uh, you know any more of a relationship between the United Church and the NDP than there is, which is say no relationship at all. But even in your question, you talk about the tightness of United Church policy and NDP policy. That can't be helped. I mean, if we both if both the NDP and the United Church come to the same conclusions about Aboriginal rights or same-sex marriage or whatever the case may be, that's just the way it is.
And back to that point about the implications or the way that your left-wing
Well, I
politics and
think this
your
is a very
Christian beliefs
this
play
is
out.
becoming
We've
more and more
talked
of an
about a
interesting
few of
question
those,
because
about the social
um,
gospel. So I want to ask a
we now
question
have a
about the
situation
environment
where
and how you see the current
it's not
relationship between faith and
the case
environmental issues.
that you have people from a faith perspective arguing with a secular government about what should or should not be done in terms of the environment. You actually now have uh, within the uh, within the government, or at least within the religious universe that the government that people in the government inhabit from time to time, an attitude towards environmentalism that is quite hostile. It's not just a case of saying, well, yeah, that's the ideal, but we still have to have a healthy economy, and we still have to have this, and we still have to have that. We think you people are right, but you're in a rush, or you're not being realistic enough. No, the attitude now on the part of the government is you're not just being unrealistic or idealistic. You're wrong, uh, and so we now see a kind of hostility to the environmental movement that we haven't seen, as far as I know, ever before, where you know environmentalists and environmental organizations are being caricatured as foreign influenced by foreigners. Uh, I think this is particularly hilarious when if the issue is has to do with the oil industry and the tar sands, for instance. Like, we mustn't have American environmentalists commenting on the tar sands. That would be terrible. That would be breach of Canadian sovereignty. But if they're owned by foreign interests, even whether those foreign interests be American or it seems more likely now the Chinese, well, that's okay. I mean, it's okay to have Canadian resources owned and operated for the benefit of some other country, but we certainly wouldn't want anybody from south of the border commenting on whether that might be good for the environment or not. So I think that's we've got a very interesting thing happening there, and just recently, Andrew Nikiforuk, who's a respected Canadian journalist, wrote an article, and which is now makes the same point in his book that he just published on. I think it's called "The Energy of Slaves." It's about the oil industry, where he points to the fact that there's this group called the Cornwall Alliance. You might want to Google them if you're interested in this, which is a collection of evangelical professors, scientists, engineers, etc., who, and I hadn't heard about it until I read Nikiforuk's article, and they think that all environmentalists are just kind of closet Marxists, so there are people within the evangelical community who see climate change, for instance, as the threat to the planet and to creation that it truly is. So certainly don't want to kind of paint everybody with that same brush. I think there's now a debate within that community. Uh, there's the Evangelical Climate Initiative. I can't remember exactly the name of it. There's lots of evidence that within that community, uh, there are particularly a younger generation that wants to move beyond a preoccupation with two or three issues and look at the environment, look at poverty, a number of other issues. But there's also pushback within that community, and it's a fair question, and it's been asked by journalists, not by me, Lawrence Martin, Nikiforuk, as to what extent does that sort of hostility towards environmentalism inform elements of the government's policy.
I'm thinking about your comment about younger people and the pushback and the willingness to engage multiple issues. And I know that you teach a course at, I believe it's the Knowles Woodsworth Center for Theology and Public Policy, and so that you're continually in conversation with younger people. And I think I read in your book somewhere that this gives you a lot of optimism. But where I'm going with this is I'm wondering if
Well,
you
I
can
mean,
comment
I
on the
wouldn't.
whole view that Parliament is
The course that
believed
I
to be
teach at the University of
increasingly
Winnipeg is through the
ineffectual and
theology
perhaps
department, not
useless.
actually through the
Um,
center itself.
how would you
As
answer
an
that
adjunct,
question in
I do
light
that
of
as an adjunct
uh,
professor
whether,
of the
in
theology
light of what I'm
department at
assuming
the
to be
University of Winnipeg.
optimism coming from the
My
younger generations?
optimism, if you like, comes from the fact that I think uh, that to the extent that there is this a lot of younger folk within, let's say, the evangelical community, that they might actually be uh, sort of spiritual capital, if you like, of the next social gospel, whatever it comes to be called, because it may not be called social gospel. I just use that, as I say, in a generic sort of way. As they push the boundaries of their concern about, HIV/AIDS in Africa or poverty or the environment, they're going to run into certain kinds of structural questions. Going to say, why is this so hard? Who are we up against here? Why can't we make this happen? Why might not the bill that's the private member's bill that's in the House of Commons right now that wants to make generic drugs more available in Africa? Why is it so hard to get that bill passed? Well, maybe it's got something to do with the power of the multinational drug corporations and the influence that they have over policymaking. And once you start to talk about structural sinfulness, if you like, you've stepped into what the social gospel was all about, which is to say, we're not just talking about individual sin here or individual salvation. We're talking about social structures that are themselves sinful and therefore need to be, if not entirely redeemed, changed so that they are less sinful, so that they permit the distribution of needed drugs, or going back a few decades, so that healthcare is taken out of the marketplace and not made a source entirely of profit, but distributed according to need. Whatever the case may be, as this new generation asks those kinds of questions, I'm hopeful that they will come to some very old conclusions about how things work and about how their faith compels them to be politically active in a different way than they perhaps might have started out with. As far as Parliament, sorry, I didn't answer the question about Parliament. I mean, Parliament has never been a pretty place. If you go back, there's I don't want to kind of romanticize Parliament because it's always been a difficult place. It's always been contentious. But I do think, and I certainly experienced this over
So
the
what then
30
do you
years
see
that I
as
was
the
there,
hope?
I think the quality of debate
Yeah.
has suffered. I didn't always think it was great to begin with. But it has suffered. There's something a little bit more petty about it. There's more ad hominem. It's accompanied by all these negative ads that happen even when there isn't an election on. Bad enough that they happen when there's an election on. They shouldn't happen at all. There's just a kind of a nastiness to the whole exchange that is different. It's not that people weren't nasty to each other from time to time. It's just that there's a kind of a repetitive, day in and day out kind of nastiness. It's not just when people are particularly excited or particularly disagreeable or particularly vexed about something. No, no, this is the way they're going to be every day. They're going to get up and attack each other and use procedural opportunities in the House that used to be used to put new ideas or to put other kinds of thoughts on the record. Now, a lot of these procedural opportunities are used only for partisan uh, uh, criticism of the other side. And frankly, I don't think it's all that effective, but it's a culture that's very hard to break once it sets in, and it has set in. Well, I mean, I think
Do you
people,
see
you know,
that
people have got to
changing? Because
demand
I see a bit of a paradox from the optimism we feel
a
from
better
the
standard
way issues are
of
being
discourse
explored by
from
younger
their
people
politicians.
and
It's very
the
hard to do.
nastiness
It means
that's
you have to pay
inherent within
attention.
our
Of course, what
political
happens if you
structures.
pay when the
Do
first
you, do you
when you
see
pay
that
attention for the first
nastiness
little while
changing
before they
as that
change their ways,
optimism
it's
grows,
so
or
bad you just want to stop listening.
what could you comment on the
But
trend?
if you want to keep listening and keep commenting and keep giving kind of feedback that MPs and political parties need to hear about how much a civil discourse would be appreciated, I think that has the possibility of, and of course, and then not rewarding that discourse. If you have people that abuse Parliament and use all kinds of procedures in ways that they were never intended to do to avoid accountability, and then they get reelected, uh, you know, this is not exact. This is, you know, positively reinforcing the wrong behavior.
We just have a few minutes to go, and I want to respect your
Well, I think
other
the thing that I
commitment yet
enjoyed the
this
most
evening,
as
but
I
I'm wondering if you can answer
was not
more
so
of a
much the
personal
analytical
question. I'm curious
point
to
of
hear
view
from
or the
you
analytical
what
parts or even the
gave
theological
you the most
reflections,
joy as you were
although I
writing the
enjoyed
book.
that.
What
It was telling the
was most
story,
meaningful to you? Maybe a
and this was
chapter
actually a
or a
criticism that
particular
was leveled
topic.
against the book
Maybe you
by
can
one
comment on
reviewer,
the writing of the
was that I
book.
mentioned too many people, that I was constantly mentioning people. And I wasn't name dropping. I was doing something that I think needs to be done, and that is to show how politics is people, is people interacting. And often the stories in politics only get told of the people that, you know, they're just the prime ministers and the leaders of the opposition, instead of all these other people that are involved. And I just had the great opportunity to encounter so many of those people along the way. And I just wanted to include as many of them as I could. So if I'd had my way, I'd had even more names in there, but my editor sometimes restrained me in that regard. But part of it was just trying to include people in the story of our country and what had gone on, particularly in Parliament and in federal politics over those 30 years. And I found it particularly enjoyable when I could see the pleasure on people's faces that, oh, yeah, I was there. I was in the room when that decision was made. And you mentioned that I was there because a lot of what happens is rendered anonymous by history if it's not told properly. Well, I hope that. Go ahead.
And I think that that acknowledgement in some small way contributes to counteracting the nastiness or the
Well, I was
negativity in
just
the
going to say that
dialogue
some
that we
of
were
the reviews
talking
of the
about. So
book,
I think that's a very
well, in fact,
significant
all
thing
of
that
them
you've
have been,
done.
that they found it to be a kind of
Now, I'm
uh,
wondering if you could,
generous. It's not sort of like, you know,
I'll
it's
let you
not
make
kind
your
of a
comment,
fix
and
and
then I'm
sell book.
wondering if
It's
you
not
can
a
comment on what you
I was
found
right
to
and
be the
they were
most
wrong
challenging part
kind
of
of thing.
writing the book.
It's, you know, I tried to present both sides, while of course arguing for the things that I agree with, you know, more with more passion than the things that I don't agree with. Uh, so, in terms of your question about the challenges, uh, sometimes it was just I wrote, you know, I wrote the whole thing myself. I was writing it while I was a provincial cabinet minister. I had a very busy life, and I spent a lot of time on the computer between 11 o'clock at night and 2 o'clock in the morning. Missed a few deadlines, um, but I'm now going through my papers. I have 50 boxes of papers at the United Church Archives, and of course, as I go through them, I think, oh, gee, I wish I I wish I had remembered that. So part of it was writing it in such a way that I felt I had covered what needed to be covered. And sometimes explaining it. My editor would say, you need to, I would sometimes write it in a way that assumed a certain familiarity with the topic. And he would say, well, not everybody knows what that person did or what that issue, what that controversy was about. You need to explain it a bit more. And so just trying to write it in a way that was helpful, that was pedagogical, if you like. That could be if somebody wanted to, they don't want to just read a kind of a pro NDP book. They want to read something that will help them to understand uh, the issues better from from all the perspectives that contributed to the debate at any one time. And of course, that's where I'm going tonight. There's a debating contest at the University of Winnipeg, sponsored by the University of Winnipeg Debating Society. They've got some high school students there, and uh, they are going to be awarding for the first time the Bill Blaikie Cup for debating, and they wanted me there to present it. So that's why I have to rush off, and why we had to schedule this webinar a little earlier than we had once planned. Because debating, a good debate is a helpful thing. You know, a good debate is a helpful thing, but a bad debate is really unhelpful. Wherever people are encouraged to debate well and thoroughly and with a certain amount of respect for the often for the truth that's being expressed on the other side.
Well, I'm
Because
very
there's always a kind of a kernel of truth in most positions. I wouldn't say every position, but and getting inside each other's perspectives and trying and I think is one of the things that we're called to do, so we can understand people better. Not so we necessarily agree with them, but we can understand where they're coming from and relate to each other better as a result.
Well, I'm very encouraged and grateful for your contribution to the discourse on faith and politics, and also for your willingness to engage your own faith and to explore how that impacts
Well, thanks
on
to you,
your
Josephine, and
political
thanks to everyone
decisions
who participated
and
and
the
asked
work
me the
that you've been
questions.
involved
And